The Birth of the United States by Isaac Asimov. The Road to Revolution. Sam Adams and T. Sam Adams had to wait for more incidents, and for a while it seemed he would have to wait in vain. 2 years passed in profound quiet, and it seemed that Americans had won their immediate victories and had subsided into comfortable acquiescence to British policy. In early 1772, for instance, it was announced that the governor of Massachusetts and the judges of that colony would be paid out of royal funds, thus making them independent of the colonial legislature, yet that hardly caused a ripple outside Massachusetts itself. But then came a dramatic incident. The various American harbors were patrolled by small British naval vessels on guard against the smuggling. Naturally, these were unpopular with those who smuggled and with those who were anti-British for any reason. One of them, the Gaspé, was particularly efficient at its job. And then, on the night of June 9, 1772, the Gaspé, while chasing a smuggler, unluckily went aground on a sandbank and came to a helpless halt. The news spread, and many Rhode Islanders were astounded at this stroke of luck and took quick action. Before the night was over, a mob had gathered, boarded the ship, maltreated the men aboard, hustled them to shore, and then burned the ship. When the news reached Great Britain, the government was furious. It was the British fleet that protected the home island and the far-flung interests abroad, and no outrage could be permitted against any ship that was part of the Navy, even if it was only a small revenue cutter. A reward of £500, enormous in those days, was proclaimed for anyone who would identify any of those who had committed the outrage, and it was announced that any who were apprehended would be taken to Great Britain for trial. The British, of course, had good reason to suspect that anyone committing an act on behalf of the right to smuggle would never be convicted in a colonial court, but it was nevertheless a serious error to announce a British trial for such malefactors. For one thing, it did them no good, for despite the reward offered, not one person was turned in. Instead, the threat of a treason trial in Great Britain was played up everywhere. It was easy for anyone in the colonies to believe that no American accused of treason could possibly receive a fair trial in Great Britain. The accused would be far from home and would be surrounded by men alien to him and filled with anti-American prejudice. Who could feel safe? Many Americans who were completely loyal to Great Britain had nevertheless made hasty remarks at the worst of the angry reaction to the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts. If they were called to account for that and sent to Great Britain for trial, what then? And in the light of that, the royal payment of judges in Massachusetts began to look like an attempt to make colonial judges creatures of the British government. The cry of British tyranny began to have a very personal terror about it. Sam Adams was, of course, not asleep. He had found a man after his own heart in a bright and articulate physician, Joseph Warren, born in Roxbury, Massachusetts, on May 30, 1741, who had brought himself to the attention of the radicals by a fiery and effective speech he made on the occasion of the second anniversary of the Boston Massacre. On November 2, 1772, Adams and Warren put their propaganda machine into high gear. Adams had long been sending letters to all points of the colonies, always urging united action. But now he and Warren formed committees of correspondence to handle the letter-writing procedure wholesale, and to form a network of propaganda that would help unite the colonies in favor of the radical cause. Within 3 months, 80 such committees were established in the various towns of Massachusetts, and other colonies were beginning to take it up. In Virginia, for instance, the House of Burgesses officially established a Committee of Correspondence on March 12, 1773. Among the members of this group was Patrick Henry, of course. Also included was Thomas Jefferson, born in Shadwell, Virginia on April 13, 1743, and Richard Henry Lee, born in Stratford, Virginia on January 20, 1732. George Washington, who was anti-British but not radically so, was not among them. Sam Adams, with a multi-colony-wide organization at his disposal, waited for his next chance. It came from an unexpected direction, and it involved the small tax on tea imports that had been left over from the Townshend Acts. This tax on tea had continued to be maintained, and, on the whole, Sam Adams, despite all his efforts, had not been successful in rousing resistance against that one small tax, or in convincing people that they ought to fight for principle when things, on the whole, were prosperous and quiet. If Great Britain had left things at that, all might yet have blown over. Unfortunately, though, the East India Company was in trouble. The East India Company was a private firm formed in 1600 to compete with the Dutch East India Company in trade with the Far East. In its checkered history, the East India Company reached the peak of its fame when it established what was virtually an empire of its own in India during the mid-18th century. In 1773, however, the East India Company was having financial difficulties over the matter of tea. India was a great tea producer, and the East India Company had millions of tons of tea at their disposal for which they had no market. In the ordinary course of events, the East India Company would have had to put up the tea for auction in Great Britain, knock it down at dirt-cheap prices to British merchants, who would then probably manage to sell it here and there at a profit. The British government, anxious to save the company, granted it the right to sell to British colonies directly and freed it of the necessity of paying taxes on the tea. This meant that the East India Company could sell the tea to the Americans at a considerably higher price than it would have received at auction, and yet, thanks to the lifting of taxes, at a price cheaper than the Americans could obtain it elsewhere. Tea was a popular drink in the colonies, and the East India Company was sure it would sell enough to pull itself out of the red. But now it was no longer a matter of a mere tea tax. Various tea merchants in the colonies would be put out of business, as the East India Company would use its own agents in an effort to cut down still further on middleman losses. Many tea smugglers would also lose a great deal of revenue, since even through smuggling they would not be able to meet the competition. Besides that, even to those who were not directly hurt, the mere notion that the Americans could be used to supply the money that would pull a British company out of the red was humiliating. It might be painless this time, but what a dangerous precedent it would set. Sam Adams's committees of correspondence got to work at once and found no difficulty in working up a storm of indignation against the new state of affairs. Plans were made to boycott tea and even to prevent tea shipments from being landed. The East India Company, unaware of trouble, shipped off 500,000 pounds of tea to Philadelphia, New York, Charleston, and Boston. As it turned out, not a pound of it was sold. In Charleston, the tea was unloaded, stored in damp cellars, and was never bought or used. In Philadelphia and New York, matters didn't even go that far. The ships were not allowed to unload, and were forced to go back to Great Britain with the tea still in their holds. It was in Boston, predictably, that the situation proved worst. There the ships carrying the tea couldn't unload, but they refused to leave. They remained in the harbor, partly because 2 sons and a nephew of Governor Hutchinson had been appointed agents for the East India Company, and stood to make a good deal of money if the tea could be landed and sold. For 3 weeks the ships remained in Boston Harbor, while Governor Hutchinson tried to get the colony to pay the duty and accept the shipment. Then Sam Adams took direct action. On December 16, 1773, a group of Sons of Liberty disguised in Mohawk costume boarded the ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into the harbor. Nothing else on board the ship was damaged. This came to be called the Boston Tea Party.